What does freedom mean to a nation that has lived under foreign rule for over 300 years? For the people of Indonesia, it meant more than just raising a flag. It meant fighting for identity, dignity, and the right to shape their own destiny. This is not just a story of war, but of courage, unity, and an unshakable dream that refused to die. Indonesia's long history under colonial rule began in the early 17th century when the Dutch arrived through the Dutch East India Company. At first, it was trade that brought them spices like nutmeg and cloves, highly valued in Europe. Over time, trade turned into control, and control into domination. The Dutch gradually took over territories across the Indonesian archipelago, using military force, manipulation of local rulers, and a system of economic exploitation that benefited the colonizers while keeping the local people in hardship life. Under Dutch rule was difficult for the vast majority of Indonesians. Farmers were forced into systems like the cultivation system, where they had to grow export crops for the colonial government rather than food for their families. Profits went overseas while poverty grew at home. Education was limited and mainly served the needs of the Dutch elite. But despite these challenges, resistance never disappeared. Over the centuries, various local rebellions broke out. Some were led by sultans, others by village leaders, and later by emerging nationalist thinkers. These early resistances were often crushed, but they planted seeds. As the 20th century approached, the idea of Indonesia as one nation began to take root. Students and intellectuals, many of them educated under the Dutch system itself, began writing, organizing, and dreaming of independence. Groups like Budi Utomo and Serikat Islam formed, advocating unity and the rights of Indonesians. The colonial system, though powerful, was also fragile, built on inequality, forced labor, and suppression. The more Indonesians understood their shared identity and history, the stronger their desire grew to stand as a free people. This long, painful experience under foreign rule laid the foundation for the larger struggle that was to come, a struggle that would turn dreams of freedom into a living reality. In 1942, during the height of World War II, Japanese forces invaded and swiftly occupied the Indonesian archipelago, which was still under Dutch colonial rule. The Dutch colonial government collapsed quickly, and for the first time in centuries, Indonesia was no longer ruled by a Western power. The Japanese presented themselves as liberators of Asia from Western imperialism, and at first, some Indonesians welcomed their arrival with cautious optimism. However, this hope faded as the Japanese occupation proved to be harsh and exploitative. The Japanese imposed strict control over daily life, forced labor, and food rationing. Millions of Indonesians were coerced into labor projects such as building infrastructure for the Japanese war effort. Many were sent abroad as forced laborers, known as Ramusha, and countless never returned. Yet, the Japanese occupation had an unintended effect that weakened Dutch influence and opened new political space for Indonesian nationalists. The Japanese allowed limited political activity and used local leaders to help administer the territory. Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, two major nationalist figures, were brought into Japanese propaganda efforts but also used the opportunity to connect with the people and organize support. Education, military training, and nationalist symbols were promoted selectively by the Japanese, creating a new generation of Indonesians with a stronger sense of identity and purpose. The experience of being ruled by a non-European power, combined with the hardships of occupation, deepened the desire for true independence. When Japan's defeat became imminent in 1945, the power vacuum left behind created a rare and fragile moment for Indonesian leaders. The Japanese collapse marked a turning point, as it weakened colonial authority and gave nationalists the momentum they needed to declare independence. The years under Japanese rule were difficult, but they changed the political landscape in a way that made the dream of freedom feel possible. On August 17, 1945. Just 2 days after Japan surrendered to the Allies in World War II, Indonesian leaders Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta stood before the people and declared the birth of a new nation. This moment came after decades of struggle, centuries of colonial rule, and the recent harsh years of Japanese occupation. The decision to proclaim independence was not made lightly. Japan's defeat created a sudden power vacuum across the archipelago. The Dutch, still recovering from Nazi occupation in Europe, were not in a position to immediately return, and Japan's administrative structure was collapsing. Nationalist leaders knew this window of opportunity might not last long. And Hatta, supported by youth groups and other nationalist forces, decided to act before the Allies could re-establish colonial control. In a modest house in Jakarta, they read aloud a brief but powerful declaration of independence. It was simple, direct, and bold. This moment electrified the country. News of the declaration spread quickly, igniting celebrations in towns and villages. Indonesian flags were raised, and people of all backgrounds came together, hopeful and proud. However, the challenges ahead were immense. The Dutch refused to recognize the declaration and prepared to return with military support from Allied forces, particularly the British. Yet, for the people of Indonesia, something had already changed. That one announcement, spoken with conviction and courage, transformed a dream into a cause. It united the archipelago's many islands, cultures, and languages under a single national identity. The proclamation was not just a statement. It was a call to action, a promise of dignity, and a new beginning for millions. While it would take years of struggle to secure formal recognition, the spirit of independence had been declared, and it could not be silenced or reversed by colonial force. After Indonesia's declaration of independence in 1945, the Dutch refused to accept the loss of their prized colony and attempted to re-establish control. This led to a 4-year conflict known as the Indonesian National Revolution. From 1945 to 1949, it was a turbulent and violent period marked by battles, diplomacy, shifting alliances, and widespread suffering. Initially, British forces entered Indonesia to oversee the Japanese surrender, but they soon found themselves drawn into clashes between returning Dutch forces and Indonesian nationalists. In cities like Surabaya, fierce resistance erupted. The Battle of Surabaya in November 1945 became one of the most iconic moments of the revolution. Thousands of Indonesians, including poorly armed youths and civilians, fought against well-equipped British and Dutch troops. The cost was high, but the battle showed the world how determined Indonesians were to defend their newfound independence. Over the next several years, Indonesia faced repeated military offensives from the Dutch, who labeled them police actions, but these were full-scale attacks aimed at crushing the Republic. In response, Indonesian guerrilla fighters took to the forests, mountains, and villages. Using hit-and-run tactics, sabotage, and underground resistance networks, leaders like Sukarno and Hatta were arrested at times, but the Republic continued to function, moving its capital and leadership to stay ahead of the attacks. The war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the international arena. Indonesian diplomats worked tirelessly to gain recognition and support from other nations. Meanwhile, civilians bore the brunt of the conflict. Displacement, food shortages, and violence became common. Still, the spirit of unity and resistance held strong. The revolution became more than a political struggle. It was a movement fueled by deep-seated pride, the memory of colonial oppression, and the hope for a future in which Indonesians could shape their own destiny. As the Indonesian national revolution continued, international attention began to shift toward the conflict. The brutality of Dutch military operations and the resilience of Indonesian fighters caught the eye of countries around the world. The newly formed United Nations became involved, pushing for diplomatic resolutions and ceasefires. The United States, which had just emerged as a global power after World War II, played a significant role. American officials began to pressure the Netherlands to negotiate with Indonesian leaders, partly because the US wanted stability in Southeast Asia, and partly due to its anti-colonial stance in the post-war era. The Cold War was beginning, and the fear that Indonesia might turn toward communism if ignored gave the West a strong reason to support a peaceful solution. After several failed agreements and renewed fighting, international mediators facilitated talks between the Dutch and Indonesian representatives. These talks eventually led to the Round Table Conference in The Hague in 1949. The negotiations were complex, filled with debates over sovereignty, debt, and the future of Dutch economic interests in Indonesia. In the end, the Dutch agreed to transfer sovereignty to the United States of Indonesia, a federal state arrangement that was meant to ease the transition. On December 27, 1949, the Netherlands formally recognized Indonesia's independence, ending over 3 centuries of colonial rule. This recognition came not as a gift, but as a result of relentless struggle, international diplomacy, and widespread global sympathy for the Indonesian cause. For the people of Indonesia, it was not only a political victory, but a moment of validation. The world had finally acknowledged their right to freedom. The recognition did not erase the pain of war or occupation, but it marked a turning point, allowing the country to begin healing and building its own future on its own terms. The legacy of the Indonesian War for Independence is deeply woven into the identity and spirit of the nation. Though independence was officially recognized in 1949, the memories of resistance, sacrifice, and struggle have remained powerful influences on Indonesian society. The war left behind physical and emotional scars. Many families lost loved ones. Cities were damaged, and the economy was weakened by years of conflict and colonial extraction. Yet out of this hardship emerged a powerful sense of unity and pride. For the first time, Indonesians across thousands of islands saw themselves not just as Javanese, Sundanese, Bolognese, or Achenese, but as part of one independent nation with a shared destiny. The revolution helped solidify Bahasa Indonesia as the national language, creating a common voice that could unite the country's diverse regions. The war also shaped Indonesia's early political system. Sukarno, who had become the symbol of resistance, emerged as the country's first president. And the values of nationalism, self-reliance, and anti-imperialism became central to the nation's political ideology. Schools began teaching the story of independence as a source of national pride, ensuring that younger generations would remember the cost of freedom. National holidays like Independence Day on August 17th serve not only as celebrations, but also as moments of reflection. The war influenced Indonesia's foreign policy especially in its early years, choosing to remain non-aligned and supportive of other countries fighting colonialism. Over time, economic challenges and political shifts would test the ideals of the revolution, but its legacy has remained. The history of the war is not just a past event, but a living part of Indonesia's national soul, reminding its people that independence was not handed to them. It was earned through resilience, unity, and an unbreakable belief in their right to be free and self-governing. The story of the Indonesian War for Independence is more than a timeline of battles and treaties. It is the story of a people who refused to surrender their identity, even after centuries of foreign rule. Through hardship, sacrifice, and unity, Indonesians stood up, not just to claim their land, but to define who they were as a nation. From the seeds of resistance under Dutch colonization, to the hope sparked during the Japanese occupation, and, finally, to the brave Declaration of Independence in 1945, every chapter in this journey showed the strength of a people determined to be free. The years of revolution that followed tested their courage, but also united them in purpose. With the world watching, and history unfolding, Indonesia earned its rightful place among free nations. The legacy of that struggle lives on today, not only in the textbooks or monuments, but in the hearts of every Indonesian who remembers what it took to build their future.